36 hours can redraw the world. That's how this was introduced. In a video posted directly to his own social media account, the president declared that over the past 36 hours, the United States and its partners have launched Operation Epic Fury. Not a briefing, not a joint address, a self-released video announcing what he called one of the largest, most complex, most overwhelming military offensives the world has ever seen. Largest the world has ever seen. Pause there. In those 36 hours, he said the U.S. hit hundreds of targets in Iran, including Revolutionary Guard facilities and Iranian air defense systems. He said, "We knocked out 9 ships plus their naval building." He emphasized it happened all in a matter of literally minutes. Hundreds of targets, 9 ships, minutes. Now hold that scale steady. He then stated that Iran's formerly supreme leader is dead. He described him as a man with the blood of hundreds and even thousands of Americans on his hands. He claimed that last night all over Iran, the voices of the Iranian people could be heard cheering and celebrating in the streets. A supreme leader dead, an entire military command gone as well, officials calling by the thousands, asking for immunity. That's not a limited strike. That's regime-level language. But here's where the tension tightens. In the same message, he confirmed that 3 U.S. military service members have been killed in action. He said there will likely be more. Combat operations, he declared, continue at this time in full force, and they will continue until all of our objectives are achieved. No timeline, no defined ceiling, no stated endpoint. And the announcement did not happen before a press pool. There were no reporters present to ask how many aircraft were used, no officials on Sunday shows fielding questions, just a direct message describing an offensive of historic scale while warning of additional American casualties. When a president says an operation is among the most overwhelming ever conducted, confirms U.S. troops are already dead, and promises the mission will continue until all of our objectives are achieved, the story is no longer just about what was hit. It becomes about where this is heading. 36 hours in, hundreds of targets destroyed, 3 Americans killed, more expected, and objectives still expanding. This is not a closed chapter. It's an opening move. If this were contained, it would already be over. Instead, he made something unmistakably clear. Combat operations continue at this time in full force, and they will continue until all of our objectives are achieved. That sentence changes the scale. This is not described as retaliation, not a single night strike, not a narrow response. It is framed as an operation with objectives still unfolding. And those objectives were not defined. No number, no condition, no visible endpoint. But here's where the pattern starts to emerge. He said the entire military command is gone as well. He claimed that many of them want to surrender into saving their lives, that they are calling by the thousands, asking for immunity. Calling by the thousands. If accurate, that signals structural collapse inside a military hierarchy. Not pressure, collapse. At the same time, he urged the Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian military police to lay down your arms and receive full immunity or face certain death. Full immunity or certain death. That's not battlefield language alone. That's regime pressure language. Now step back. Hundreds of targets hit. 9 ships destroyed. A supreme leader declared dead. The entire command structure described as gone. Immunity offers extended. U.S. casualties confirmed. More expected. But watch what's missing. There was no mention of congressional authorization, no description of Allied participation beyond the United States and its partners, no explanation of how one of the largest offensives in modern history was operationally sustained over 36 hours. Instead, the framing leaned heavily on inevitability. He described Iran as the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. He said an Iranian regime armed with long-range missiles and nuclear weapons would be a dire threat to every American. He stated, "We cannot allow a nation that raises terrorist armies to possess such weapons." That's not tactical framing. That's existential framing. And existential framing removes time limits. Because if the threat is described as civilization level, they have waged war against civilization itself, then containment becomes insufficient. The language shifts from response to elimination of capacity. Now the contradiction sharpens. He campaigned on ending wars in the Middle East, on not launching new ones, on bringing troops back home. Yet here, he confirmed 3 American service members are already dead, and said there will likely be more. This is where control starts slipping. An operation described as historically overwhelming, an open-ended objective, casualties already mounting, immunity offered to collapsing leadership, and a direct appeal to all Iranian patriots who yearn for freedom to seize this moment. That is no longer just a military strike. That is a momentum shift. The question is no longer what was hit. The question is how far this is designed to go. Here is the claim that anchors everything. He said the Ayatollah is dead. Iran's formerly supreme leader is dead. Those were the words. He called him this wretched and vile man and said he had the blood of hundreds and even thousands of Americans on his hands. That is not a minor battlefield update. That is decapitation language. If true, it represents the removal of the highest symbolic and religious authority inside the regime. That is not tactical disruption, that is structural rupture. Now notice what follows. He said that last night, all over Iran, the voices of the Iranian people could be heard cheering and celebrating in the streets when his death was announced. Cheering in the streets. That detail matters, because it frames the strike not only as military action, but as liberation. It implies internal validation. It suggests the operation triggered popular celebration. But here's the critical pivot. There were no images presented in the announcement, no footage shown in that video, no independent confirmation referenced in his remarks, just the assertion. And when a leader declares the death of another nation's supreme authority without immediate corroborating detail in that same address, the weight of that statement hangs entirely on the speaker. Now widen the lens. He said the entire military command is gone as well. Gone how? Removed? Killed? Fled? The phrase is sweeping, absolute, no qualifiers. He added that many are calling by the thousands, asking for immunity. If command structures are collapsing and officials are calling by the thousands, that suggests internal fragmentation, panic, or at minimum, destabilization. But here's the fracture in that narrative. At the same time he described collapse, he warned that combat operations continue at this time in full force. If leadership is gone and surrender calls are flooding in, why does the operation remain in full force? That tension matters, because either the collapse is incomplete or the objectives extend beyond leadership removal. And then he escalated the moral framing. These actions are right and they are necessary, he said, to ensure that Americans will never have to face a radical, bloodthirsty terrorist regime armed with nuclear weapons. Never have to face. That is totality language. It doesn't describe degrading capacity. It describes preventing existence of a future threat altogether. Notice what's absent again. There was no discussion of diplomatic channels, no mention of back-channel negotiation, no timeline for de-escalation, no definition of what achieving all of our objectives would look like. Instead, the narrative builds toward permanence. He declared, "The United States has the strongest military the world has ever seen." He said, "There's nobody even close." That is capability assertion, paired with open-ended objectives, paired with confirmed casualties, paired with a declared leader dead. This is no longer a question of whether the operation was large. It's a question of whether it was designed to permanently reshape the structure it targeted. And once that door opens, it rarely closes quietly. There was a moment in the address where the tone shifted from force to inevitability. He said, "For almost 50 years, these wicked extremists have been attacking the United States while chanting the slogan, 'Death to America,' or 'Death to Israel,' or both." 50 years. That number reframes the strike as the culmination of a half-century conflict arc, not a reaction to a single event, not a short-term escalation, a generational confrontation reaching a breaking point. When an action is framed as the answer to 50 years of hostility, it stops being temporary. It becomes corrective, and corrective actions are rarely small. He continued, "These intolerable threats will not continue any longer. Not reduced, not negotiated, not managed, will not continue." That phrasing signals finality. But here's where normalization begins to shift. He acknowledged directly that there will likely be more U.S. casualties. Not hypothetically, not cautiously, likely. And he added, "That's the way it is." That line is quiet, almost blunt. 3 service members already killed in action, more likely coming. Combat continuing in full force, and the framing presented as the burden of a free people. "This is the duty and the burden of a free people," he said. Duty, burden, sacrifice normalized inside an expanding operation. This is where something abnormal begins to feel procedural. A massive offensive described as historic, leadership declared eliminated, command structures described as collapsing, American casualties confirmed, more expected. And yet the language shifts toward routine inevitability. He said America is now again the richest, most powerful nation in the world by far. He tied military action to prosperity and security. The only reason we enjoy the quality of life that we do and the freedom and security is we have done things that others are unable to do. That's not battlefield explanation, that's civilizational justification. And once military force is framed as the mechanism that protects everyday life, the threshold for its continued use lowers psychologically. Now the pattern becomes visible. Step 1, define the threat as existential. Step 2, frame the operation as historically overwhelming. Step 3, confirm casualties but normalize them as necessary. Step 4, assert unmatched military superiority. The result? An environment where continued escalation feels less like a choice and more like a foregone conclusion. But remember, combat operations continue at this time in full force. No endpoint, no visible ceiling, and casualties already acknowledged as likely to increase. This is the point where an operation stops being an event and starts becoming a new baseline. Now the contradiction hardens. He said, "We are now using that military for good. We want to have it for good purpose." That was the framing. The strongest military the world has ever seen, rebuilt in his first term, now being used for good. But measure that claim against the details he provided. Hundreds of targets in Iran, 9 ships plus their naval building, combat operations in full force, 3 U.S. service members killed in action. There will likely be more. Good purpose, full force, more casualties expected. Those realities sit side by side. This is where language and consequence collide. He warned that an Iranian regime armed with long-range missiles and nuclear weapons would be a dire threat to every American. He said, "We cannot allow a nation that raises terrorist armies to possess such weapons." And then he delivered the line, "Not going to let it happen." That's a categorical boundary, not going to let it happen. When a leader draws a categorical boundary around a perceived future capability, long-range missiles, nuclear weapons, the operational logic shifts from deterrence to prevention. Prevention is preemptive. Preemption expands scope. And here's the pivot. He didn't describe a single facility tied to nuclear development. He described hundreds of targets. Revolutionary Guard facilities, air defense systems, naval assets, entire command structures. That scale suggests this is not a narrow strike at one capability. It's systemic disruption. And then came the ultimatum. Lay down your arms and receive full immunity or face certain death. It will be certain death. Won't be pretty. Full immunity, certain death. Those are absolute poles. There is no middle ground presented in that framing. No gradual de-escalation path outlined in that address. Only surrender or annihilation. This is the line that reframes everything. When surrender becomes the publicly offered option, the objective is no longer just deterrence. It is submission. Now stack that against the earlier statement that many are calling by the thousands, asking for immunity. If thousands are already calling, and the ultimatum is now public, the pressure becomes exponential, internally and externally. But here's what intensifies the instability. He acknowledged, calmly, that more American service members will likely die. That means the cost is not hypothetical. It is already unfolding. And yet the objectives remain undefined beyond until all of our objectives are achieved. Undefined objectives plus acknowledged rising casualties equals open-ended commitment. And once an open-ended commitment is framed as moral necessity, these actions are right and they are necessary, backing away becomes politically and psychologically harder. This is no longer about what was struck. It's about whether the operation is designed to stop at capability reduction or continue until structural surrender. And if it's the latter, the scale we've seen may only be the beginning. Now the tempo accelerates. First, the declaration of a leader dead. Second, the claim that the entire military command is gone. Third, confirmation that 3 U.S. service members have already been killed. Fourth, the warning that there will likely be more. These are not isolated updates. They stack, and stacking changes momentum. He said America will avenge their deaths and deliver the most punishing blow to the terrorists who have waged war against basically civilization. Not just retaliation, the most punishing blow. That phrase signals escalation potential beyond what has already occurred. Because if hundreds of targets and 9 ships destroyed are not yet the most punishing blow, then the ceiling has not been reached. Now add another layer. He directly called upon all Iranian patriots who yearn for freedom to seize this moment, to be brave, be bold, be heroic, and take back your country. That is not purely military messaging. That is internal activation language, encouragement of internal action. When external force and internal encouragement converge, instability multiplies. But here's where the structural risk sharpens. He described Iran as the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. He framed the threat as one that could extort the world to their evil will. And he positioned the United States as the world's greatest and most powerful nation, capable of stopping it. Greatest power, most punishing blow, open-ended objectives, more casualties expected. Now imagine the feedback loop. Each additional U.S. casualty increases pressure to intensify operations. Each intensified strike increases the likelihood of further retaliation. Retaliation increases domestic justification for further escalation. This is how momentum becomes self-sustaining. And remember, combat operations continue at this time in full force. Full force implies active engagement. Aircraft in the air, naval assets deployed, missiles launched. It is not symbolic. 3 already dead, more likely. Objectives undefined. Internal surrender offers extended. Public ultimatums issued. At this point, the operation is not static, it is cascading. And here is the question that begins to press against the edges of the frame. What happens if this doesn't slow down? Now step out of the strategy room and into your own life. When a president says an operation will continue until all of our objectives are achieved, and admits there will likely be more American casualties, that is not abstract. That is a timeline without a visible end. Open-ended military operations do not stay contained to distant coordinates forever. They move through budgets, through deployments, through headlines, through markets, through families. 3 U.S. service members have already been killed in action. That means 3 families received a knock. 3 sets of parents, spouses, or children were told that a 36-hour escalation changed their lives permanently. And he said there will likely be more. That word, likely, is not theoretical. It is predictive. Now look at the framing again. He described this as protecting Americans from a regime that could become a dire threat to every American. He tied the operation to preventing a future where Americans face a radical, bloodthirsty terrorist regime armed with nuclear weapons. Every American. That includes you. When threats are framed at that scale, the justification for prolonged engagement expands with them, because if the threat touches every American, then the response can justify touching every American life indirectly. Military escalation affects energy markets. It affects global shipping lanes. It affects diplomatic alliances. It affects whether young service members are deployed repeatedly. He said, "This is the duty and the burden of a free people." Duty and burden are not symbolic words. They translate into taxes, deployments, policy shifts, security measures. And here's the personal fracture. If objectives remain undefined and combat continues in full force and casualties are already rising, then the duration becomes uncertain. Days, weeks, months? That question was not answered. When uncertainty stretches, anxiety fills the gap. This is no longer about ideology. It's about stability. It's about whether this becomes a contained operation or the beginning of a prolonged engagement that reshapes foreign policy priorities and domestic realities at the same time. If this feels close to home, say that in the comments. Because once an operation moves from event to trajectory, the distance between foreign conflict and personal consequence narrows faster than most people expect. Step back even further. Strip away the speeches, the tone, the adjectives. Look at the mechanism. A large-scale military operation is launched. It is described as one of the largest, most complex, most overwhelming ever seen. Leadership decapitation is announced. Command structures are said to be gone. Casualties are confirmed. More are predicted. Objectives are undefined. Combat continues in full force. Now, focus on how that was delivered. Through a direct social media video. No press pool present, no immediate cross-examination, no extended briefing with layered detail in that moment. That delivery method matters, because modern power no longer moves only through institutions. It moves through narrative velocity. Direct-to-audience messaging compresses reaction time. It shapes perception before external validation or challenge can catch up. This is not about whether the claims are accurate. It's about structural acceleration. When a head of state can announce the death of a supreme leader, the elimination of an entire military command, and an ongoing, open-ended operation in a single, uninterrupted message, the information environment becomes synchronized with the operation itself. Narrative and force move together. That changes feedback loops. In slower eras, military escalation was followed by briefings, delays, diplomatic countersignals. Now the declaration, the justification, and the ultimatum. Lay down your arms and receive full immunity or face certain death. Travel instantly, globally, unfiltered in that initial moment. This compresses decision cycles on all sides. If surrender calls are indeed coming by the thousands, as claimed, the information shock alone could amplify internal instability. If they are not, the perception of collapse still alters calculations. Here is the systemic insight. When objectives are undefined and framed as moral imperatives, these actions are right and they are necessary. The operational boundary becomes elastic. Elastic boundaries expand under pressure. And because the threat was described as civilization level, they have waged war against civilization itself. The moral ceiling for escalation rises. That is how structural momentum forms. Not just through missiles and ships, through framing, through delivery, through speed. And once speed enters the system, reversal becomes harder than escalation. Now we enter the trajectory window. There are two plausible paths forward, based strictly on what was stated. Path 1, rapid structural collapse. If the entire military command is gone, if officials are calling by the thousands asking for immunity, if a supreme leader is indeed dead and public celebrations are occurring all over Iran, then the regime's internal cohesion may fracture quickly. In that scenario, the ultimatum, lay down your arms and receive full immunity or face certain death, accelerates defections. Combat operations in full force apply pressure. The cost curve becomes unbearable. The system folds faster than expected. That path leads to sudden realignment. But here's the counterweight. Path 2, hardened retaliation. If leadership decapitation creates martyrdom instead of collapse, if most punishing blow rhetoric triggers asymmetric response, if additional U.S. casualties materialize, as he warned they likely will, then escalation compounds. Each new casualty intensifies the promise that America will avenge their deaths. Each retaliatory move validates the framing that this is a battle against forces that have waged war against civilization itself. That feedback loop does not stabilize quickly. And remember, objectives were not defined. Combat continues until all of our objectives are achieved. Undefined objectives plus rising casualties equals adaptive escalation. Now watch the timing. We are only 36 hours into what was described as one of the most overwhelming offensives ever launched. Only 36 hours, and already 3 U.S. service members are dead. Already 9 ships destroyed. Already leadership declared eliminated. Velocity this high rarely decelerates smoothly. It either collapses systems quickly, or it hardens them. There is very little middle ground in rhetoric framed as existential and final. The next move is not theoretical. It is forming right now, inside military command rooms, inside political chambers, inside the calculus of those being pressured with full immunity or certain death. And when momentum is this strong, the next move often defines the entire arc. 36 hours did not just produce strikes. They produced a pivot point. A president announced one of the largest, most overwhelming military offensives the world has ever seen. He confirmed hundreds of targets in Iran, 9 ships plus their naval building. A supreme leader declared dead. An entire military command described as gone. 3 U.S. service members killed in action, more likely to come. Combat continuing in full force until undefined objectives are achieved. That is not a narrow chapter. That is a structural shift. Because when force is described as overwhelming, objectives are open-ended, surrender is publicly offered with full immunity, and resistance is warned to face certain death, the conflict stops being episodic. It becomes directional. Here is the reframing. This is not just about what was destroyed. It is about whether the threshold for decisive, open-ended military action has permanently lowered. If an operation of this scale can begin, escalate, confirm casualties, and promise continuation within a 36-hour window, delivered directly to the public without live questioning in that moment, then the model of how power is exercised has evolved. Speed is now strategy. Narrative is now force multiplier. And objectives without ceilings create horizons that keep moving. 3 Americans are already gone. More are expected. The mission continues. So the real question isn't whether Operation Epic Fury was overwhelming. It's whether we have just witnessed the opening phase of a doctrine where overwhelming becomes the default response to existential framing. Because if that doctrine holds, this story doesn't end with this operation. It sets the template for the next one. If you want to understand where that trajectory leads and what signs to watch for before the next escalation, subscribe. The next move is already forming.